The first time I saw her, I almost didn't. That's how it works at the Velkassen Gate. You come through the pass-hauling route, surveys, and cargo manifests, and you keep your eyes on the ground because the wind at that altitude will freeze them open if you don't. Sits at the throat of the corridor. A squat stone building with a pitched metal roof and a loading yard that faces east toward the valleys. 40 meters of open courtyard, a fuel depot, a provisions counter staffed by a Velsarin trade liaison who never smiles, and a stone bench against the northern wall just past the cargo ramp where someone was sitting. I noticed her, the way you notice a shadow that doesn't move when the sun does. Everyone else in the courtyard was in motion, convoy drivers checking axle locks, trade clerks cycling their manifests, fuel runners threading between the vehicles with their heads down. She was still, sitting on the bench with her hands in her lap and her back against the wall, and her face turned slightly toward the pass, as if she were watching something none of us could see. I didn't think about it. Not that first transit. I logged my cartography updates with the liaison, loaded my pack, and went through the gate into the eastern descent. I had 14 waypoints to survey before the next fuel window. That was the job. You move, you map, you file, you don't sit down. I've been a supply cartographer for 7 years. Before that, I ran freight routes on the inner system corridors, which is dull work but steady, and before that, I was a dock crew laborer at Velkassen outstation, which is hard work and not steady at all. I came to cartography because I liked the precision of it. A map is either right or it isn't. An elevation marker either matches the ground or it doesn't. There is a cleanness to that, a world where accuracy matters, and the thing you produce is true. The Velkassen Gate was the center of my route. Every survey loop started and ended there. I knew the courtyard the way I knew my own hands, every stone, every shadow angle, every shift in the wind pattern between seasons. I knew which fuel runners worked the morning cycle, and which ones covered the afternoon. I knew which trade clerks filed fast, and which ones held you at the counter while they double-checked jurisdiction stamps. I knew the exact spot where the loading ramp met the courtyard stone, and how the ice formed there first, after a squall. I did not know who was sitting on the bench. The second time, I noticed her again. Same bench, same posture, same stillness. The courtyard was busier that day. A diplomatic resupply convoy had come through from Velsarin proper, and the loading yard was stacked 3 rows deep with sealed freight. I had to thread sideways through the vehicles to reach the provisions counter, and as I did, I passed within 8 meters of her. She was alien. That was obvious even at a glance. Blue-gray skin, the color of riverstone in late afternoon light. Dark hair, almost black, cropped short, shorter than any Velsarin woman I'd seen, which struck me even then as unusual. Their women wore their hair long and braided, threaded with house sigils. Hers was close to the skull, uneven, as if it had been cut with something not meant for cutting hair. Her eyes were large, dark amber brown, set wide in a face that was thinner than it should have been. She wore a long coat, gray, no insignia, and boots that had been good once. No one looked at her, I mean that precisely. The courtyard was full, 40, maybe 50 people cycling through at any given moment, and not one of them glanced at the bench. The fuel runners walked past her as if the bench were empty. The trade clerks filed their manifests with their backs to her. The convoy drivers loaded cargo 6 meters from where she sat and never turned their heads. It wasn't avoidance exactly. It was something more thorough than that. It was as if she had been subtracted from the visible world. I filed my cartography updates. I loaded my pack, I went through the gate, and this time, as I passed her, I looked. She didn't look back. But something in her posture shifted, a fractional tilt of the head, a half-breath drawn and held, and I knew she had seen me see her. The third transit was 11 days later. I came through the pass in a squall, ice on my visor, the wind loud enough to make conversation impossible, even if there had been anyone to talk to. The courtyard was half empty. The provisions counter was shuttered for the storm cycle. Most of the way station's transients had crowded into the interior hall to wait it out, and the loading yard was a grey wash of ice particulate and blown grit. She was on the bench, the same bench in the storm. Her coat was pulled tight, and her hands were in her pockets, and her face was turned into the wind. The ice hadn't driven her inside. I stood in the courtyard for a moment, pack on my shoulders, visor frosted, and I looked at her, and she looked at me. Her eyes were steady, not pleading, not angry, not hopeful, just steady, the way a person's eyes are when they have stopped expecting anything and are simply registering what is. I went inside. That night, in the interior hall, I sat near the provisions officer, a Velsarin clerk named Fatoran, who managed the gate's supply ledger, and who, unlike the liaison, would talk if you bought him a cup of Velsoth. I bought him a cup. We talked about the squall. We talked about the Eastern's survey corridor, and then I asked about the woman on the bench. Fatoran set down his cup. "Don't," he said. I waited. "She is Vel-Kethai," he said. The word came out flat, almost clinical, name stripped, formally excised from the house registry. Her house, Veldoroth, one of the old families, struck her from the record 14 months ago. The decree was registered with the conclave court. Her name was removed from every document, every index, every bloodline file. She does not exist in any system we recognize. "She exists on that bench," I said. Fedrin looked at me the way you look at someone who has just said something so obvious it can only be dangerous. "If you speak to her," he said, "or acknowledge her in any documented way, a greeting, a transaction, a shared table, the Conclave Trade Office can flag your transit credentials. You are a supply cartographer. Your route clearance runs through Velsarin jurisdiction. If they flag you, you lose the corridor, no appeal, no review window. For talking to someone, for acknowledging a Vel-Kethai, the social architecture of the decree is absolute. She was made invisible. Anyone who makes her visible again shares the contamination." I sat with that for a while. The squall hammered the shutters. The hall smelled like Velsoth and cold stone, and the particular staleness of 50 people crowded into a room built for 20. "What did she do?" I asked. Fedrin picked up his cup. "She refused to annul a territorial accord that would have surrendered 3 of Veldoroth's outer system protectorates to House Veltharan. The protectorates are populated, mining families, station workers, dockside communities. The annulment would have transferred governance without consent. She refused. Her house needed the Veltharan Trade Alliance more than it needed the protectorates, so it needed her gone. She refused to sell people. She refused to sign the document. The document would have sold people." Fetron said nothing. He finished his cup. He stood. "Don't talk to her. Cartographer," he said. "She will still be on that bench whether you talk to her or not, and you will still have your route." He left. I sat alone in the hall and listened to the ice against the shutters, and thought about what it meant to be made invisible. Not imprisoned, not executed, not exiled to some far station where at least the absence was geographical and comprehensible. Just made into nothing. Left in place, in the courtyard, at the gate, where everyone could see her, and no one was allowed to look. 14 months. I thought about what 14 months of that would do to a person. Not the cold, not the hunger, I assumed the way station provided subsistence rations to anyone in the courtyard, Velketh I or not. The Velsarin Civil Code required it. But the silence. 14 months of being in a room full of people who had all agreed, formally and without exception, that you were not there. The squall broke the next morning. I shouldered my pack and went into the courtyard. She was on the bench. I walked past her toward the gate, and then I stopped. I set my pack down. I reached into the side pocket where I kept my thermal flask, the good one, the one with the double seal that kept Velsoth hot for 9 hours, and I set it on the bench beside her, not close enough to touch her hand, just close enough that she could reach it without standing. I didn't say anything. I didn't look at her. I picked up my pack and walked through the gate and down the eastern descent, and I didn't look back. The next transit, the flask was on the bench where I'd left it. She hadn't moved it, but it was empty. I filled it again. I set it down. I walked through the gate. This became the routine. Every transit, and I came through the Velkassen gate every 8 to 12 days. Depending on the survey load, I set the flask on the bench beside her. I never spoke. I never sat. I never looked at her longer than a breath. The flask was the only communication, and even that was deniable. A cartographer left a flask on a bench. Benches are public furniture. Flasks sit on them all the time. I told myself it wasn't an acknowledgement, that it didn't count, that the provisions counter was 6 meters from the bench, and maybe I'd just set the flask down while I adjusted my pack straps and forgotten to pick it up. These are the lies a careful man tells himself when he is doing something that is not careful at all. The truth is that I set the flask down because she was cold, and because no one else was doing it, and because a person sitting alone in a mountain courtyard for 14 months should not also have to be thirsty. The truth is not complicated. It rarely is. No one said anything. The convoy drivers didn't look. The fuel runners didn't pause. The trade clerks kept their backs turned, and the flask kept getting emptied. I started noticing other things. Small details that only accumulate when you're paying attention to someone the world has agreed not to see. The way she shifted position on the bench when the wind changed, always turning slightly into it, never away, as if she had decided long ago that facing the thing that hit you was better than letting it find your back. The way she tucked her hands into her sleeves when the temperature dropped below a certain threshold. Not huddling, never huddling, just a precise economy of motion that spoke of long practice. The way the light moved across her face in the morning and how her eyes tracked the gate, watching the travelers come and go the way a captain watches a harbor from the dock of a ship that no longer sails. She was not defeated. That was the thing I kept coming back to. Whatever the Velkethai decree had done to her standing, it had not touched whatever was inside her that held her back straight, and her eyes level and her hands still. She sat on that bench the way a queen sits on a throne. Not because she had to, but because she had decided to, and no bureaucratic decree was going to change the architecture of her spine. On the 6th transit, maybe the 7th, I set the flask down and she spoke. "You'll lose your route." Her voice was lower than I expected, quiet. Not rough from disuse the way I'd imagined. Controlled. The kind of voice that had once given orders in large rooms and was now being used at the lowest volume it could sustain. "I know," I said. "Then why?" It wasn't a question, not really. It was the sound of someone who had stopped asking questions 14 months ago and was now encountering a fact that didn't fit the framework she had built to survive. "Because you're sitting on a bench in the cold," I said, "and you're a person." She looked at me, her eyes dark amber brown, large, set wide in that thin blue-gray face, held steady, no tears, no trembling, nothing soft or grateful or broken, just a long, level look that said she had heard me and was deciding what to do with it. "Sit down," she said. I sat. We didn't talk. Not that day. We sat on the stone bench in the mountain wind, and she drank from the flask, and I watched the courtyard empty and fill and empty again, and neither of us said anything. The fuel runners passed. The trade clerks filed. The diplomatic convoy loaded its sealed freight and pulled out through the western corridor, and the courtyard went quiet, and we sat. It was enough. The next transit, I sat again. This time she spoke. Not much. She told me the bench faced east because the morning sun hit the wall behind it, and the stone held the warmth for a few hours. She told me the provisions officer, Veteran, left a subsistence ration packet at the base of the bench every third day, always before dawn, always without looking at her. She told me the Velsoth in my flask was better than anything the way station served. I told her my name, Torben Cade. Supply cartographer, Eastern Survey Corridor, Velsarin Transit Jurisdiction. I told her I had been running the pass for 3 years, and that I had mapped every waypoint from the Velkassan summit to the Tarith Valley floor. I told her the maps were better than anyone cared about, because accuracy is the only form of pride available to a man whose job is to walk. She almost smiled. Not quite, but the muscles around her eyes shifted, and the line of her mouth softened, and something in the air between us became less cold. "What is your name?" I asked. She went still. Not the stillness of the bench, the practiced stillness of someone who has made peace with being invisible. This was a different kind. Tighter, more fragile, the stillness of someone who has not heard the question in 14 months and is not sure the answer still belongs to them. "Eshara," she said. "Veldoroth." She said it carefully. "The way you say something you are afraid will break if you press too hard." The house name came second, quieter, as if she were testing whether it still fit. "Ishara Veldoroth," I said. She closed her eyes. 1 breath. 2. When she opened them, they were wet. Not crying. The Bible of her composure would not permit that. Not here. Not in the courtyard, where anyone might see. But wet. The light caught the film of moisture, and her eyes held it, and she looked at me, and I understood I had said her name. That was it. That was the entire act. In a world that had formally agreed she didn't exist, a human cartographer had sat down on her bench and said her name out loud, and the sound of it in the cold air of the Velkassan gate was the most radical thing either of us had done in years. I kept coming, every transit. I sat on the bench, and we talked. Not the way people talk when they are filling silence, not idle, not performative. The way people talk when every word has been earned by months of quiet and no one wants to waste them. She told me about the protectorates, the 3 outer system territories she had refused to surrender. Veldroth Reach, Veldodroth Marker, Veldoroth Cut. Mining stations, dockside towns, families who had lived under Veldoroth governance for 6 generations, 11,000 people. She knew them by district. She knew the name of the shift supervisor at the Reach primary mine. She knew the dockmaster at Cut, who had petitioned her office for a storm shelter expansion 3 years before the annulment. She had approved the expansion. The shelter had been built. She remembered the cost to the nearest decimal. The annulment document would have transferred them to House Veltharan, which ran its territories on extraction, quotas, and debt labor. She had read the terms. She had understood what the transfer meant, and she had refused. They told me it was a formality, she said, that the protectorates would barely notice the change, that Veltharan governance was restructured, modernized, that the families would adapt. You didn't believe them. I read the Veltharan labor code. She paused. Section 9, subsection 14, the debt accrual clause. If a worker's output falls below quota for 2 consecutive cycles, the shortfall is converted to personal debt against the worker's household. The debt carries compound interest at the Veltharan standard rate. There is no ceiling. She said it the way she said everything, quietly, precisely, without dramatics. But her hands folded in her lap were tight. 11,000 people, she said, miners, station workers, dock crews, families, their children. I was not going to sign them into that. They signed you out instead. My house needed the Veltharan Trade Alliance. The alliance required the protectorates. I was the obstacle. So they removed me. Name stripped. Name stripped. She turned the word over, as if examining it from a new angle. Velkethai. It is an old practice. The conclave haven't issued the decree in 40 years. My house had to petition for a special session. 3 senior adjudicators. They cited precedent from the Velsarin colonial era. It took them 2 hours. 2 hours to erase you. 2 hours, 14 months ago. And here I am. Here she was, on a stone bench at a mountain gate, in a coat with no insignia, with hair cut short because the exile mark required it, with large dark eyes that held everything and showed only what she chose. A queen who had refused to sell 11,000 people and had been sold instead. I said her name again, Eshara, not because she needed to hear it, she knew who she was, but because the courtyard needed to hear it, because the fuel runners passing 3 meters away with their heads down needed to know that someone in this place was willing to say it. The flag came on my next transit. I knew it would. Veteran had warned me, and I am not a man who ignores warnings. I am a man who hears them, weighs them, and sometimes does the thing anyway. The trade liaison at the provisions counter, the one who never smiled, handed me my updated transit credential with a yellow margin flag on the jurisdiction line. Notation from the Velsarin Trade Office, she said. Your Eastern Corridor clearance is under review. Pending review, you may continue to transit, but your topography filings will be held in escrow rather than processed. How long is the review? Indefinite, which meant, until you stop sitting on the bench with the Velkethai, your maps go into a drawer and your work ceases to exist. Not a termination, something more elegant than that, a slow erasure, the same techniques scaled down. I took the credential. I walked into the courtyard. I sat down on the bench. Eshara looked at the yellow flag on the credential in my hand. You should stop, she said. Probably. I am not asking you for this. I know. Torben. She said my name the way I had said hers, carefully, as if it carried weight. I have been here 14 months. I have made my peace with the bench. I do not need you to lose your work for me. You didn't lose your throne for yourself either, I said. You lost it for 11,000 people you'd never met. She was quiet for a long time. The wind came down from the pass, and the courtyard emptied, and the afternoon light moved across the stone wall behind us, and we sat. My house believes the protectorates were signed over, she said finally. After my removal, the acting regent, my cousin, Vel Arath, executed the annulment. The transfer was filed with the conclave court 6 days after my name was struck, so it happened anyway. It happened anyway. I sat with that, the weight of it. She had given up everything. Her name, her house, her throne, her place in the visible world, and the thing she had given it up to prevent had happened anyway. 6 days later, a cousin's signature where hers would not go. Was it worth it? I asked. She turned to me. Her eyes, those large, dark, amber-brown eyes that carried 14 months of silence in them, held mine. I couldn't stop it, she said. I know that now. I couldn't stop the transfer. I couldn't save the protectorates. I could not do the thing I wanted to do. She paused. but I didn't sign it. My name is not on that document. When the miners in Veldoreth Reach are working under debt-accrual quotas, and the dog families in Veldoreth Cut are calculating compound interest on their children's futures, my name is not the name that put them there. She looked at the courtyard, the empty courtyard, the stone bench, the wind. That's what it cost me, she said. And yes, it was worth it. I understood then. Not just what she had done, but what the bench was. It wasn't punishment. It wasn't exile. It was the place where a woman sat, with the only thing she had left. The knowledge that she had not signed her name to something unconscionable. The bench was the price, and she had paid it, and she sat with it every day in the cold, and she did not regret it. I set the flask between us. She drank, I drank. The afternoon wore on. The next transit, Fetteron found me in the interior hall. He looked tired. He set a cup of Velsoth in front of me and sat down across the table and spoke quietly. "Your Eastern Corridor clearance has been suspended," he said. "Not under review. Suspended. The Velsarin Trade Office filed the action this morning. Your cartography credentials are frozen. Your survey data from the last 4 transits has been purged from the filing system. 4 transits, 2 months of survey work, gone." "They're not going to reinstate you," Fetteron said. "I've seen this before. Not with cartographers. With trade clerks, fuel contractors, anyone who acknowledged a Velkethai on record. The suspension becomes permanent. You can petition, but the petition goes to the same office that issued the suspension." "How many people have they done this to?" Fetteron looked at his cup. "You're the first," he said. "In 14 months, you are the first person who has spoken to her long enough for them to notice." I let that settle. 14 months. Hundreds of transients through the gate. Convoy drivers, trade clerks, fuel runners, diplomatic staff. And not one of them had sat down on the bench. Not one of them had asked her name. "I'm going to sit on the bench tomorrow," I said. Fetteron closed his eyes. "I know you are. You leave her a ration packet every 3rd day." He opened his eyes. Something moved behind them. Surprise, maybe, or the discomfort of being seen doing something decent. "The civil code requires subsistence provision," he said. "It's not the same. It's not nothing." He stood. He picked up his cup. At the door of the hall, he stopped. "Her name," he said, without turning around, "before the decree. She was Eshara Veldoreth, 3rd of her line. She governed 4 systems and 9 stations, and she was considered one of the most capable administrators the Conclave had seated in a generation." He paused. "I am not telling you this. It is not permitted." The next morning I walked into the courtyard with no pack, no survey kit, no transit credential. I had nothing to file, nothing to map, nothing to carry through the gate. I was a cartographer with no corridor, a man whose map had been erased from the system. I sat down on the bench. Eshara looked at me. She looked at my empty hands. She understood. "They suspended you." "They did." "Torben, Eshara." We sat. The morning sun hit the wall behind us, and the stone held the warmth, and the courtyard filled with the day's first transit traffic, convoy drivers, fuel runners, trade clerks, all of them walking past the bench without looking, the way they had walked past it for 14 months, the way they would walk past it tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. "I am going to say your name," I told her, "not to you, to them." She looked at me. Her eyes were steady, wet at the edges, composed. "You understand the cost. I've already paid it." I stood up. I walked to the center of the courtyard. The fuel runners were threading between the vehicles. The trade clerks were cycling their matnafests at the provisions counter. The convoy drivers were checking axle locks in the loading yard. Fetteron was at his ledger behind the counter glass. I stood in the open, and I said it. "Her name is Eshara Veldoreth." not a shout, not a declaration. I said it the way you say something that is true. Plainly, at a volume that carried across the courtyard without strain. The way you say a map coordinate, the way you say the name of a pass you've walked 100 times. The courtyard didn't stop. That would have been too dramatic, and this world doesn't work that way. The fuel runners kept threading. The convoy drivers kept checking axle locks. The trade clerks kept cycling manifests. But Veteran looked up from his ledger, and one of the fuel runners, a young Velsarin woman with braid-wrapped hair and grease on her hands, paused mid-stride and glanced at the bench. And for 1/2 second her eyes met Ishara's, and she saw her. She saw a person sitting there, not a Velkethai, not an empty bench, a woman. Then the moment passed, and the fuel runner kept walking, and the courtyard resumed its indifference. I walked back to the bench. I sat down. Ishara's hands were in her lap. Her back was against the wall. Her face was the same face it had been for 14 months, composed, still, steady. But her eyes were different, not wet, not this time, something quieter than that. A shift in the depth of them, as if a room that had been closed for a long time had just had its window opened, and the light was finding corners it hadn't touched in a year. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't do anything. You said my name in a place that agreed to forget it." She looked at the courtyard. "That is not nothing. It didn't change anything. It changed the fuel runner's eyes." She paused. For 1/2 second, she looked at me. She saw a woman sitting on a bench. Not a designation, not an empty space. A woman, that is a change. I thought about that. 1/2 second of eye contact in a courtyard full of people who had been trained not to see her. It was not a revolution. It was not a reversal. It was not even, by any administrative standard, an event, but it was a crack in the agreement. A fracture so small you could only see it if you were sitting on the bench. 1/2 second, I said. 1/2 second is longer than 14 months of nothing, she said. We sat. The sun moved. The stone cooled. The transits came and went. I never got my corridor back. I want to be clear about that. This is not a story where the brave act is rewarded with reinstatement, where the trade office reverses its decision, where the maps come out of the drawer and the yellow flag is lifted and everything goes back to the way it was. It doesn't work that way. The Velsarin Trade Office is a bureaucracy, and bureaucracies do not reverse themselves because a cartographer said a name out loud in a courtyard. I lost the Eastern Survey Corridor. 3 years of work, every waypoint from the Velkassan summit to the Tarith Valley floor, every contour line, every elevation marker, every fuel cache coordinate purged. I am, by the official record, a man who mapped nothing. That is a strange thing to live with. The ground doesn't change. The mountains are still there. The waypoints I surveyed are still waypoints. The fuel caches are still cached. The elevation markers still match the ground. The contour lines still describe the shape of the land. My maps were accurate. I know this because I walked every meter of them, and I checked every reading twice, and accuracy was the thing I had. It was the one form of pride available to a man whose job is to walk. And now it's in a drawer somewhere, or it isn't anywhere, and the next cartographer, who says the Eastern Corridor, will walk the same ground I walked and have marked the same waypoints I marked, and never know that someone was there before them. I found other work. Freight logistics on the western routes, where the Velsarin Trade Office has less jurisdiction and the transit credentials are processed by a different bureau. The work is flat. The routes are mapped already. There is nothing to discover and nothing to name. I haul manifests between stations that someone else surveyed, and I file them with clerks who do not care about accuracy because accuracy is not what freight logistics is for. but I go through the Velkassan gate. The western routes pass through it, and every transit I sit on the bench. Eshara is still there. She will be there tomorrow. The decree has no expression, and her house has no interest in reversing it, and the conclave court meets once a year and has not placed the matter on its docket. She sits on the stone bench with her hands in her lap and her back against the wall, and her face turned slightly toward the pass, and the courtyard moves around her, and she is still. But the fuel runner, the young woman with the braids, leaves a ration packet at the base of the bench now. Not every third day, every day. She doesn't look at Eshara when she does it. She doesn't speak. But the packet is there, and it is something more than the civil code requires. And Veteran has started leaving the provisions counter unlocked on cold nights. Not officially, not on the record, but the latch is open, and the interior hall is warm, and Eshara sleeps inside when the temperature drops, and no one files a notation. Small things, quiet things. The kind of things that don't show up in a conclave docket or a trade office filing. The kind of things that happen when one person says a name so out loud and the silence around it cracks just enough for others to hear it. I sit on the bench. I fill the flask. The Velsoth is hot, and the stone is cold, and the mountain wind comes down through the pass the way it has for as long as anyone has mapped it. Eshara drinks. I drink. We talk about the protectorate sometimes, the mining families in Veldorath Reach, the dock crews in Veldorath Cut. She asks if I've heard anything. I tell her what I know, which is not much. The debt accrual quotas are in effect. The compound interest is running. The families are paying. She listens. Her hands tighten in her lap. Her eyes hold it. I didn't sign it, she says. No, I say. You didn't, and that is enough. That is the thing I came to understand sitting on that bench. That sometimes the only thing you can do is refuse to sign, and sometimes the only thing someone else can do is say your name, and sometimes the cost of both of those things is everything you had, and sometimes it is still worth it. I said her name. The courtyard heard it. The courtyard forgot it. I said it again. Eshara Veldorath, third of her line, the queen who would not sign. I am the cartographer who lost his maps. We sit on the bench. The sun hits the wall. The stone holds the warmth. It is enough.